Did you attend this year's Collective Impact Conference? I did. I'm part of Bright Beginnings Backbone team. I help them with their data strategy, so I attended the conference to learn from other collective impact approaches. And I definitely feel like I learned a lot, and I want to share that with you in this video. If you want to become a more data-informed nonprofit, initiative, or organization, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any upcoming videos. One of the major themes of this conference was the importance of storytelling, and it really highlighted to me how storytelling can be used as a vehicle to facilitate conversations around difficult topics, but also as a way to collect data. Penumbra had several artists share their first experiences with racism, and it really highlighted the power story has to help us have conversations that can be very difficult with each other. It's a way for us to acknowledge, attend to, and hopefully start addressing difficult issues. Junius Williams shared in his session how community stories can be a way for us to collect not only community voices into our data systems or data processes, but also for us to explore how we are engaging our communities. Nashina Hussain from the Islamic Sisterhood of Empowerment uses story to help advocate for her community, and she helps encourage people to share their stories by helping them see how their stories are not just about them, but will ultimately help others in their community. For example, if one person shares an experience they've had, it can help someone else in their community start the healing process. Living Cities presentation focused on how to measure racial equity, and their presentation really highlighted how there are some concepts that can't be truly understood with quantitative data alone, and that there needs to be some sort of mechanism for us to collect stories and make sense of those stories in a systematic process so that we can truly understand how our policies or our equity work is affecting or influencing our community's lives. Child 360 actually created a short video explaining how to do qualitative analysis to their community members so that they can participate in that process as well. The next major theme or lesson I took from the conference is the importance of working towards equity, and that doing work that should improve the equity in our communities is not just beneficial for those in vulnerable populations, but can benefit us all. And if we don't actively work towards equity, we can be inadvertently further perpetuating some of the inequities in our communities. One example that really stood out to me is the curb effect. And this is an example of how improving equity can help others in the community as well. And cities went around and changed their sidewalks to make sure that the curb dips down so that people who use wheelchairs can have an easier time getting around. This didn't just help those in wheelchairs, it helped a lot of other people in the communities. For example, people who had strollers. The folks from Living Cities shared a framework they used to help understand racial inequities, and it is the person role systems framework. In this framework, we acknowledge that individuals have conscious and unconscious biases that influence their daily lives and how they react to various things. Then these people then play roles, and their unconscious biases and conscious biases sort of influence how they play those roles within the world they live, and then these roles that exist out in the world make up the system that we are all a part of. Therefore, if you want to really address racial inequities, you have to consider the roles people play and how the individual person sort of feeds into those roles. For example, you can enact all the policies you want, but if the individuals within those systems don't believe or have a mental model that supports those policy changes, then those policies may not be implemented and might just be written down somewhere without actual effect on the community. The Living Cities people also use an anti-racist, results-based accountability framework to assess how their work is going and explore how they might do things better. Results-based accountability is actually a pretty popular framework. I don't know a lot about it, but generally speaking, it asks two very broad questions. Are we doing the right things, and are we doing those things right? And like I mentioned before, racial equity is not something you can necessarily count, so they use this framework to collect stories to help them understand how their racial work is going internally and externally. And they also acknowledge that this is an iterative process, so you should always be considering the data collection tools you're using and make sure that your tools are the right tools to collect the information that will be useful to your organization. Becky Marjotta also shared a framework that I thought might be useful to consider when we're thinking about how we want to address equity within our communities. It's Karpin's drama triangle. It's 3 roles we might take when we encounter something we dislike, and these are problematic roles. There's the hero, the victim, and the villain. The hero comes in with some sort of savior mentality. They're out there looking for a problem, and they are offering unsolicited advice. The villain is cynical, and they are looking for someone to blame. And the victim is handling things in a very problematic way because they are passive-aggressive. Ask yourself if you are taking on any of these roles when you're engaging in some sort of equity work, and whether or not there is a better way for you to serve your community. I'm curious to hear how you plan to use data to acknowledge, attend to, or address the racial disparities in your community, or maybe another issue that's pressing in your community. Let me know in the comments below. Another major theme that stood out to me throughout the whole conference is the need to focus on the usefulness of data. Now, this is something that I have, been advocating for already, and I just wanted to make sure to call it out to you in this video. We all need to be proactive about creating systems to ensure that our data are useful. Junius Williams talked about the importance of creating routines so that we are regularly collecting data and regularly using that data. And something that was highlighted throughout the whole conference was that what works for one initiative might not work for another initiative. So we need to tailor these routines and systems for each initiative so that we make sure that the data we collect and use is useful and that our sense-making activities are helpful in decision-making. Joelle Cook talked about how the data you collect should give you the confidence you need during the decision-making process. And data is about learning and accountability, and those two things are not exclusive to one another. So make time to use your data, for example, have a data party. And if you're interested in learning more about that, let me know in the comments below because I'm still working on the video about data parties. The folks at Unidos contra la Diabetes, or United Against Diabetes, shared that the more people see your data activities being useful, the more likely they are to participate in those activities and to share their data as well. And an added benefit is when your data sharing agreements are not an added burden to them. Tied to making data useful is incorporating participatory approaches, and Child 360 shared some ideas that they have already done in their work that we can incorporate into our work. One is cafecitos con datos, or data cafes. This is where they have community members come to an event and then they share data with them either through a placemat or through a data gallery or through some other more interactive approach, and they have them make sense of that data. This is something that I like to call a data party. They also have literature circles where people bring in data sources or other stories they might have gathered in just living through life, and they bring community members together and they talk about the various sources, how credible they are, what the data or the source is trying to convey. This is all in an effort to promote critical thinking and to have the community look and search for data all throughout their lives. Another thing they did that I thought was very great and interesting was they reframed a theory of change. And as you probably already know, I love talking about theories of changes. So what they did was they had a mountain, and at the peak of the mountain were the long-term outcomes. Then going up the mountain were some of the short-term and intermediate-term outcomes that they were seeking to make. So this helped the community understand what the theory of change was, or what the goal of the theory of change was, and it was easier for them to understand. Another organization that had an interesting theory of change was Living Cities. So this goes to show that a theory of change doesn't have to be a linear document. It can take many shapes. All it is some sort of documentation that highlights how the things you do lead to the changes you want to see. Child 360 also created this diagram showing how they use participatory approaches to build a data culture. Another major theme or lesson learned I took away from the conference was that what we appreciate appreciates. So instead of focusing on the problems in our communities, we need to focus on the changes we want to see and be solution focused. Trabian Shorters from BME Communities talked about the importance of considering how we are framing things and to make sure we are not further stigmatizing people in our community by the way we frame issues. If all that comes to mind when we think about a group of people is their challenges, their failures, or their hardships, we are stigmatizing them. This makes it harder for some people to feel that it is fair to offer these groups of people opportunities, which makes it harder for us to advocate for equity. When groups of people or things like bugs are stigmatized, we want to either avoid them, control them, or kill them. So it's very important for us to consider how we are framing things and to make sure that we are not further stigmatizing a group of people. Asset framing is defining a group of people by their aspirations or contributions before we even talk about the challenges they're facing, and put the focus on investing in them so that they can continue to benefit society. Deficit framing is when we define a group of people based on the challenges they face and we ignore to some extent the contributions they bring to the table. And when we're thinking about how to help them, we're really thinking about how to make sure that they are less of a burden on society. If you are coming at an issue from a deficit frame, you are stigmatizing the group of people you are seeking to help. So make sure you're not doing this. So as a data person or a grant writer, make sure you're starting with the group's contributions. And if you are a funder, make sure you're asking people to highlight that group of people's contributions as opposed to only focusing on the problem. Trabian Short also highlighted 3 different mindsets that we might be taking. So you have the stigmatizer mindset. That's one where you're asking or focusing on what the problem is and whose fault it is. The second sort of mindset is the fixers. These people are problem focused. They are trying to understand what happened and how to solve it. They're probably trying to save a group of people from some sort of a threat. They're great to have if a crisis just happens, and they're trying to restore things back to their original state. Next, we have builders. So this group of people probably didn't like things how they were originally, and they're trying to focus on a community's assets and consider, where do we want to go from here? What do we want to build? So they are asset focused. So we want to be builders as much as possible. There's also room and, opportunities for fixers to come along and support work when there is a huge crisis or something initially happens that we need to, fix right away. But we definitely do not want to be stigmatizers. Something that I think pairs really well with this is Trista Harris's framework, stop, look, go. First step is to stop looking at the problem, loving the problem, and focusing on the problem. Look for potential solutions and innovations that might help you build a better future. She shared that the future always leaves clues. So look at other organizations, maybe even organizations outside of your sector, to consider what the future might look like. The goal is to make steps to consider moving in a different direction or trying out new ideas and innovations, and even building your organizations or your own capacity. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Trista and her work, she's actually offering her book on her website for free, or at least she was during the conference. If you need help identifying meaningful data, make sure to download my guide on getting meaningful data. You can do that by joining my mailing list. Once you are on my mailing list, I will send you about weekly resources, for example, any grant opportunities I run into. And feel free to help this channel by liking the video and sharing it with your colleagues. And if you like this sort of content, make sure to subscribe. If you attended the conference, I would be really curious to hear what your lessons learned were, so make sure to drop those in the comments below. If you didn't attend the conference, I would still love to hear from you. Let me know what sort of concepts or ideas piqued your interest, and I can make more in-depth videos on those topics. Don't forget to check out some of the other videos I have. I have a video on what evaluation is, what logic models are, and how to develop a theory of change.